again, everyone, and welcome once more to the Ops Center, where we put a Wargamer's focus on historical conflicts. I'm your host, Ariskany, and in this episode we're continuing our 30th anniversary look at the Gulf War of 1991. In previous episodes, we've looked at the events leading to the Persian Gulf Crisis and Operation Desert Shield, then review the transition to Operation Desert Storm, with the air war beginning on 16 January 1991. But now it's time to gear up and punch the start key on those tank engines, because even after 5 weeks of devastating airstrikes, the Iraqi army still hadn't budged from its positions in Kuwait. The ground phase of the Gulf War was on. First, let's take a look at the battlefield and review the overall deployments on both sides. From east to west, the coalition forces were deployed generally as follows. Along the Persian Gulf on the extreme right were the Joint Forces Command East. This is a collection of Saudi, Qatari, Kuwaiti, and other Arab forces, directly astride the main invasion routes back into Kuwait. It would be important for the world to see such forces leading any liberation of Kuwait. Immediately to their west were the Americans of 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, made up of 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, supported by the Tiger Brigade of the U.S. 2nd Armored. Next to the west came the Joint Forces Command North, made up of Egyptian and Syrian units. Next came the real heavy punch. This is U.S. 7th Corps, which for this operation would include the British 1st Armored Division. 7th Corps also included 1st and 3rd U.S. Armored Divisions, elements of the 2nd Armored, 1st Air Cav, 1st U.S. Infantry Mechanized, all the heavy formations that had prepared for decades to fight the Soviets head-on in Germany. On the far left wing, 200 to 300 miles deep in the open desert, was 18th Airborne Corps, including the 82nd and 101st Airborne Division, 24th Mechanized, and the French 6th Light Armored, which for this operation included troops of the Foreign Legion. This large of a deployment, that far west in the vast Arabian Desert, was greatly undermatched by the Iraqis, who had no idea such forces could even operate in such trackless desert. Now, normally the Iraqis would be right, but they didn't know about the coalition's access to a brand new technology, GPS. The Iraqis, meanwhile, were well entrenched in the Saddam Line, a thick belt of field fortifications and minefields. This was weighted heavily to the east along their forward positions in Kuwait. This is where all the highways were, all the ports, all the cities, everything the coalition would want to liberate. And it represented the natural flow where traditional armies would be channelized. The Iraqi deployment was sound. It was just 20 years out of date. Armored and mechanized divisions of the Iraqi army backed this forward line, and behind them in deep reserve were the elite Republican Guard armored and mechanized divisions. Laying the plans and commanding this invasion was General Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., sometimes called Stormin' Norman for his aggressive, no-nonsense command style. To defeat the Iraqis, he developed a plan to make the most of his force's strengths while maximizing enemy weaknesses. An infantry commander in Vietnam, Schwarzkopf was resolved not to fight a slow, grinding war of attrition, but instead win a sharp, thunderstrike campaign that would end the war in total coalition victory, hopefully in a matter of days. Schwarzkopf's plan was, in simple terms, a single envelopment. He would pin the Iraqis in place to the east with a combination of deception and frontal fixing assaults carried out by the Marines and the Arab allied forces on his right wing. Meanwhile, his, quote, Hail Mary left hook would be carried out by his heaviest hitting formation, the massive 7th Corps, including British 1st Armored Division. This force would be screened along its open left flank by the 18th Airborne Corps, slashing deep into the northern desert, cutting roads leading from the Iraqi interior, and setting up forward staging locations that 7th Corps would find waiting for them. The Iraqis had no idea this kind of operational movement was even possible, not in that kind of desert. Although mechanized armies had fought in deserts before, never in places like North Africa or the Arab-Israeli Wars had armies ever operated in terrain quite like this. We're talking about a front hundreds of miles in the middle of nowhere, advancing hundreds of miles deeper into even more nowhere. Thus the Iraqis had very little deployed out to face this threat, and their air reconnaissance had been blinded by absolute coalitional air supremacy and 5 weeks of relentless coalition bombing. To further fix Iraq's attention eastward, Schwarzkopf used press briefings in the American media, built up heavy forces to the east before secretly sliding them to the west, and showcased extensive U.S. Marine landing exercises prepared against the Kuwaiti east coast. Landings which of course would never happen. Once this deep penetration was made to the west, these army, mechanized, and airborne formations would pivot eastward, slashing behind the Iraqis pinned in place by the Marines and Arab allies, cutting the Basra Highway behind the enemy and sealing him in a cauldron. In the words of Joint Chiefs Chairman General Colin Powell, the plan for the Iraqi army was, first we're going to cut it off, then we're going to kill it. Listing all of the equipment and units in the coalition force would take all day, so let's just take a look at some of the highlights. The biggest player in the field, the United States Army, famously deployed the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank, upgraded with the German-designed 120mm smooth bore gun. With the latest in depleted uranium fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition, the dreaded silver bullet, there was no Iraqi tank that the Abram couldn't kill at ranges beyond 3,000 meters. There are documented cases of Abrams shooting through dead Iraqi T-55s to kill live tanks on the other side. Like much of the Cold War equipment expected to fight the Soviets in 1980s Germany, the Abrams would instead first be tested in real combat here, half a world away, and in wildly different environmental conditions than its expected battlefield. The main infantry carrier for the US Army was the M2 Bradley, the product of a controversial development to say the least. The Bradley would nevertheless prove itself in Desert Storm, its tow missiles making short work of Iraqi tanks, and 25mm chain gun likewise effective against Iraqi BMPs, BTRs, and infantry positions. The US Marine Corps didn't have the M1 Abrams at the time, still using the older M60 with the British 105mm L7 rifled main gun. These tanks were upgraded with ERA, or Explosive Reactive Armor panels, but it couldn't be denied that the Marines' armor lagged far behind that of the Army. The Marines were also using various versions of the LAV-25 for light armor and transport, along with the AAV-7 amphibious assault vehicle. The Marines were also still using the venerable AH-1 Super Cobra helicopter gunship, as opposed to the Army's brand new and far more deadly AH-64 Apache. British armor and artillery, on the other hand, could stand shoulder to shoulder with the US Army, which is a good thing because that's exactly how they would be committed to combat. They fielded the Challenger 1 main battle tank with the L11 120mm rifled gun and the latest British-designed Chobham armor. Their APC was the MCV-80 Warrior, just as fast as the Bradley and with a 30mm automatic cannon. Artillery for both the US Army and British Army included M109 Paladin self-propelled 155mm howitzers and the MLRS, or Multiple Launch Rocket System, definitely one of the deadliest weapons to see action in the Gulf War. Other coalition armies fielded a variety of equipment from all over the world. On the extreme west wing of the attack, the French would use their AMX-30 B-2 tank with swift AMX-10RC, AML-90, and ERC-90 armored cars. Free Kuwaiti forces would use older British Chieftains and the T-84, a Yugoslavian upgrade on the Soviet T-72. Qatar and Saudi Arabia would field older S variants of the French AMX-30 main battle tank, while Egypt and Saudi Arabia would use older American M60A3s. Meanwhile, Syria would field T-62 battle tanks, incredibly fighting on the coalition side. Iraqi vehicles and equipment, on the other hand, may look impressive on paper, but one has to remember this equipment didn't have terribly well-trained crews, wasn't well maintained, didn't have the latest electronic upgrade packages, didn't have the best silver bullet ammunition, and had been bombed to hell and back for the past 5 weeks. Morale in many units was already well beyond broken, with some Iraqi formations they couldn't even get water. Nevertheless, they were the world's 4th largest army in deeply entrenched positions, often had commanders with combat experience from the 1980 to 88 Gulf War, and they had plenty of hardware. Iraqi tanks, at least in their army, were an older mix of Soviet and Chinese types. These included huge numbers of the classic T-55. From this we have the Type 59-2, which is an Iraqi upgrade of a Chinese knockoff of the T-55. The Type 69 continues this Chinese import trend, with enhancements and features taken from the T-62, which the Iraqis also had in sizable numbers. There were also a large number of light tanks, armored cars, and command vehicles, along with BTR-60 troop carriers for the bulk of infantry transport. Then we have the Republican Guard. These were politically favored formations, lavished with better equipment, but more for their Ba'athist party loyalty than the quality of their soldiers. Here is where you find the Asad Ababil, or Lion of Babylon. These are Soviet-designed T-72s, locally built under license in Iraq. Although these were the best the Iraqis had, they were far inferior to the Abrams or the Challenger 1. Quick comparison. A NATO 120mm gun could core a Lion of Babylon at 3,000 meters with depleted uranium ammunition, while Iraqi 125mm could barely score a hit at 1,800 meters. And with Iraqi ammunition, actually doing damage was even less likely. Closer in, the Lion of Babylon became much more dangerous, especially in large numbers on American flanks. But American gunnery, anti-tank guided weapons, and helicopter gunships ensured that this practically never happened. Republican Guard divisions also had the BMP-1 and 2 for infantry transport, armed with AT-3 Sabre and AT-5 Spandrel anti-tank missiles. Although the Gulf War's ground phase officially started on 24 February 1991, large battles had in fact already taken place. Delta Force, Green Beret, Navy SEALs, and SAS units were already deep in Iraq, calling in SCUD hunting airstrikes and watching every move the Iraqis made. On 29 February, as their army was being bombed to pieces, the Iraqis desperately lashed out by sending 3 divisions down the coastal road out of occupied Kuwait and into Saudi Arabia. This resulted in the Battle of El Khafji, the first major ground battle of the Gulf War. Outflanked and pinned down by U.S. Marines from the west, the Iraqis were then savaged by Saudi and Qatari tanks and mechanized infantry, supported by more forces from Kuwait, Morocco, and Senegal. For the Marines, the battle was actually bloodier than it should have been, thanks to friendly fire incidents that would plague the coalition throughout the Gulf War and eventually account for almost half the total American dead. There were also preliminary battles fought to the west, mostly by Task Force 1st of the 41st Infantry, made up of units from the 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd U.S. Armored Division, and 1st U.S. Infantry Mechanized, or the Big Red One. Charged with a counter-reconnaissance mission, this heavy battalion task force pushed across the Iraqi border on February 15th, engaging Iraqi forces and shoving back enemy eyes from 7 Corps' upcoming main assault corridor. They also provided forward staging areas for the MLRS and other artillery units, which rained indescribable destruction on any Iraqi forces in reach, compounding the devastation already suffered from coalition bombing. Finally, on February 24, 1991, the overall ground offensive, codenamed Operation Desert Sabre, erupted across 300 miles of the Saudi Arabian border. Far to the west, the 101st Airborne flew deep into the Iraqi desert, cutting the few roads leading from the Iraqi interior and setting up staging areas like Objective Cobra. Meanwhile, the 82nd Airborne and French 6th Light Armored Division followed on their left. On the coalition's east wing, the Marines and Arab allies slammed hard into the main belt of Iraqi defenses along the Kuwaiti border, cutting lanes through thick minefields and pushing into Kuwait itself. Now, this was supposed to be a holding attack, except the Iraqis were already surrendering in huge numbers, and the aggressive Marines were soon on their way to Kuwait City. The biggest coalition punch, 7 Corps, actually stood still for now. Their initial orders were not to strike until day 2, once the Iraqis were fully convinced that the main coalition attack was indeed coming from the Marines and Arab allies to the east. Now, I know we're just getting started here, but we have to end our episode here for now. Please rest assured that the ground war is just getting started in earnest. Stay tuned for the 4th and last part of this series, where we'll look at titanic battles like Norfolk, 73 Easting, Medina Ridge, and Kuwait International Airport. We'll also look at lessons and effects of the Gulf War, and take a deep and admittedly overdue dive into how you can bring the Gulf War onto your gaming table. For now, this is Ariskany, and as always, Tango Mike for listening.